Okay, this morning we are going to start the book of Ezekiel. We're going to continue through that book. We were originally going through this book in Hebrew, but we haven't had the Hebrew class for a while, so I decided to go ahead and bring it on back through here. But no, I'm not going to go through the Hebrew directly here because that is a little bit of a difficult language, beneficial to learn, but it's an interesting language. But we're going to go through the, of course, English version of it, and we're going to be looking at some of the Hebrew behind it so that we can actually understand properly what is being conveyed here. So, in coming to the book of Ezekiel, our author is Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi. He was born in 67 BC. So, having been born in 67 BC, he was also exiled in 59 or 597 BC. His ministry began at age 30, and we can kind of see this here in even the first verse here in Ephesians or in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1, where it says, "Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the fourth month, and on the fifth day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened and I saw a vision from God." So the 30th year that he's actually referring to here is likely his age. There is an indication of the value of this over in Numbers. So over in Numbers chapter 4 and verse 3, and this is talking about priests. From 30 years old and above, even to 50 years old, all who enter the service to do the work in the tabernacle of meeting. So it's showing that they started from 30 years of age. And he was a priest. So that is indicating at that age is why he began his ministry there. He was deported with King Jehoiakim. Over in Second Kings, we see this. So this is over in 2 Kings chapter 24. 2 Kings chapter 24 and verse 14. So he carried into captivity all of Jerusalem, all the captains and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. And this, of course, when he actually took this from Babylon. And they came in and took basically everybody that was of value in the land, and they took them out of the land. And they only left those who were poor. And he was in this group that was actually taken there. He lived in a house in the city of Tel Aviv, and this would be on the Chebar River. So back over in Ezekiel is where we see this. Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 15. And it came to pass, or and I came to the captives at Tel Aviv, who dwelt by the river Chebar, and I sat there, or sat where they sat, and remained there, astonished among them 7 days. That was one of the indications. And then you drop down or go over to Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 1. We also have another reference to this area. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 1, "And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house with the elders of Judah, sitting before me, that the hand of the Lord came upon me," or fell upon me there. And of course, when you follow this within the context, it's actually telling us he was actually in the city of Tel Aviv, and this was on the Chebar River. His wife died during his ministry, and the Lord did not permit him to mourn her as a sign to the Jews. We see this in chapter 24. So Ezekiel chapter 24, verses 15 through 17 is where we see this. So in Ezekiel chapter 24, starting in verse 15, it says, "Also the word of the Lord came to me and saying, Son of man, behold, I take away from you the desire of your eyes with one stroke. Yet you shall neither mourn nor weep, nor shall your tears run. Sigh in silence, make no mourning for the dead. Bind your turban on your head and put your sandals on your feet. Do not cover your lips and do not eat man's bread of sorrow. He was not permitted to do this as a sign to Israel. This is one of the examples among many as we look at the prophets that we're going to see, especially people who try to claim they're prophets today. If you really understood what a prophet was, nobody would actually desire this. You know, they went through some pretty harsh things. And this is one of the examples of it. He was not permitted to mourn her. His name has significance in his ministry. God appointed him. So this is over in Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 8. Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 8. Behold, I have made your face strong against their faces and your forehead strong against their foreheads. Like adamant stone, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. Do not be afraid of them, nor be dismayed of their looks, though they are a rebellious house. So he actually strengthened Ezekiel. And of course, that relates to his name. Now, this hardening, the strength of Ezekiel, as we see for his ministry to Israel, was actually important because Ezekiel needed to have strength, as it states here, for a household that is very rebellious. So he needed to be very strong. And of course, as we move on in verses 10 through 11, moreover, he said to me, Son of man, receive into your heart all my word that I speak to you, and hear with your ears, and go. Get to the captives, to the children of your people, and speak to them, and tell them, Thus says the Lord, whether they hear or whether they refuse. He says, I don't care about whether they respond. I care about you speaking the word. That is his task. He is to go out and he's to do that. Ezekiel began prophesying in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. Ezekiel prophesied for about 22 years. He prophesied until March 26th, 571 BC. And we see that in Ezekiel chapter 29 and verse 17. And it came to pass in the 27th year, in the 1st month, on the 1st day of the month, that the word of the Lord came to me. And this is when he began to start his ministry, and he went on for 22 years. It's interesting. I'm using dates on purpose because although the Bible is not primarily a historical book, it is one of the best historical books that we actually have. And this is something that actually really happened in our timeline. It's not something that is a fictitious making up of somebody. We can go back and we can look at records, and Ezekiel actually lived during this time. He was actually born in 627 BC. Okay. He was exiled in 597 BC. He ministered up until 571 BC. His audience was the exiled Jews. And of course, we see that in Ezekiel chapter 3 and verse 4. That's specifically the people he is supposed to go to. So he's dealing with the exiles. So he says, Then he said to me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak the words to them, my words to them. And of course, in the context, this is the people who are currently in exile. Back over in Ezekiel chapter 1, as we begin the book, of course, he first starts out with the timing, and it says it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, and the heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. So he's going to see a vision at this point from God. He records this, of course, like I said, in the 30th year. And this is more than likely an actual reference, as I was talking about earlier, to his age. So it would be the 30th year of his life is where he's referring to. And it's based on that he would have been born, when we understand that and back it up, we know that he would have been born in 627 BC, based upon his actual age. He sees a vision. Now, a vision is something that is you are permitted to see that's not actually there, but you are awake during it. It is not a dream. Okay, so he is actually awake, but his eyes are seeing something that is not physically there at this time. He's being shown something. And this is going to be rather important because what he is going to see at first is actually the cherubim. Well, cherubim are spirit beings, and spirit beings cannot be seen by the physical eye. Okay, so he's not seeing them though with his physical eye. He's being given a vision. So within this vision, God is using images to help him understand what this spirit being looks like, and how it acts and other stuff like that. Ezekiel is going to use terminology that relates to his time also. So that's something we need to look at. But we need to be cautious to not draw it in too far into our own time. A good example of this, by the way, is in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the first heaven being rolled up like a scroll. Well, from their perspective, from the language they knew, that's the best John could do in describing what we now know would be a nuclear explosion, because that's exactly what it does, in the way it's describing. But he doesn't have that type of a terminology at that point to be able to describe it like that. So he's going to describe the spirit beings that he's going to see in this vision, this first vision here. So he is actually literally seeing them, but it's in a vision. So it's not with his physical eyes that he's seeing them. So this was in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, which you see in verse 2, on the 5th day of the month, which was in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. The word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, which of course this is where we get the fact that he was a priest, and at 30 years old he would have entered into the priesthood, being a son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. At this point, Ezekiel then has this vision. Of course, he's right by the river at this point, and you see this great storm coming in. That's what he's seeing. So he's standing there by the river and looking up into the sky, and all of a sudden he sees this storm that's not a normal storm. No, and the way that he's describing it. And then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north. Well, your whirlwind here, the word that they're translating whirlwind, really kind of expresses more of a tempest type of wind, a very strong wind. Not so much a whirlwind in the sense of like a tornado. I don't think he's actually describing that. And I was thinking about that. There is an indication, by the way, of a tornado in Scripture, and that has to do with Job and the wind that blew down his children's home. That does relate to an actual tornado, is the way it was being described. But here he's more talking about this tempest wind from the north, a very strong storm coming up. It's actually the same type of storm or whirlwind or something along those lines that took Elijah up. We see this over in 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 1. And it came to pass when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind. So we still see this indication of this whirlwind, and it does seem to be a very strong tempest wind, is what he's describing here. And this, of course, is when Elijah was actually with him. And they take up this whirlwind. We do see a lot of this particular one used in Scripture, this whirlwind. The Lord in Job 38:1, the Lord answered Job out of. Now they translate it as a whirlwind, but again, I don't think it's necessarily a good translation in the sense of it's not like a big gigantic tornado. It's more like a tempest storm. Yeah.
Would it be similar perhaps to like the Dust Bowl in the 30s here?
With a lot more intensity.
Yeah.
But yes, well, as we describe this storm, and this is why when you go through this description, it isn't twisting around. It's actually eating itself. So it's like rolling within itself. So it's not describing whirlwind is not a real good description of this particular storm, which is why I'm actually saying that. And that really has to do with as we get into the description of it. So this tempest wind from the north, Jeremiah describes the tempest wind coming upon the unrighteous over in Jeremiah 23. So it's kind of the same thing, Jeremiah 23:19. Behold, and now they translated a whirlwind, but a tempest storm of the Lord has gone forth in fury, a violent wind. It will fall violently on the head of the wicked, in describing how this is going to come to them. So again, we kind of see the description of this storm. Like I said, it's not really like he's seeing a tornado or a whirlwind. He is seeing a pretty intense storm coming towards him. And then he's going to go on to kind of describe this. And he says it's coming out of the north, back over in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 4. It's coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself. So it is this great cloud that he's actually seeing and is describing a storm cloud. And there's actually, in this concept of a storm cloud, we see over in, because he talks about a great cloud here, and this is an indication of a storm cloud. An example of the storm cloud being used, we also see, if I can get this to the storm cloud, because we see this over in Genesis chapter 9. And this is where the rainbow is actually set. So that's kind of the description that he's talking about here again on this storm. This would make it probably fairly dark at this point, but yet there's a lot of light. There's a lot of activity going on inside this storm. So over in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 13, we use the same word for cloud. And I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of the covenant between me and between the earth. So this is actually literally talking about a cloud, again, not similar to a tornado. Back over in Ezekiel. Well, actually, before I do that, we can actually see over in Exodus also an indication of this cloud. So over in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 24, because this is where the Lord actually came. He was leading Israel out of Egypt, and through the pillar of fire and cloud. And this, of course, is talking about when the army of Egypt was coming. So in Exodus chapter 20 or chapter 14 and verse 24, it says, now it came to pass in the morning watch, that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. Yeah. So he was actually in a cloud of fire by night and a cloud during the day. That's how he was with Israel at this point and leading Israel. Again, one of those quite incredible signs when you understand that, where Israel literally saw God leading them out of Egypt. He was with them the whole time. Now, back over in Ezekiel again, this is a cloud that is kind of taking itself, eating itself up, so to speak, like a rolling type of a cloud. So over in Ezekiel chapter 1, again in verse 4. So then I looked, and behold, a tempest wind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself. Now, the way they translate this is okay. It literally means a fire taking itself. So engulfing itself is not a bad description. And again, this would be like it's a rolling type of fire where it's rolling in upon itself and then coming back out. This would be pretty scary, actually, to be honest with you, in the intensity of the way he's describing this. We see this concept of taking as it's taking itself, because it's raging within itself. And they're translating it as raging, but really it's a word that means to take something. And we see an example of this over in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, where we have with Eve taking from the fruit of the tree. That's actually the same root. So a fire taking itself, not really engulfing itself, it's taking itself, is what it's describing. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden. Now, this is where, this is where in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, it's where the Lord took Adam and placed him in the Garden of Eden. Um, in verse in chapter 3 and verse 6, we have the same word being used for Eve taking from the fruit of the tree. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. So again, it's kind of using that as an example, as really the taking of fire. We also see another example of this concept of taking over in Genesis, a simple concept of taking. So this is over in Genesis chapter 21. And in Genesis chapter 21 and verse 27, we have Abraham. He took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech. So he's taking them. So it is a storm, like I said, that's kind of, it's literally taking itself. And I don't think it's a very bad translation at all to kind of imply that it's engulfing itself, because that's kind of what it's expressing. And the form, of course, in the original is reflexive. So it's taking itself, which would be engulfing is a good translation. And the brightness of it, as he looks at this, there was a shine that was all around the storm. So we have fire within the storm, but then we have this shining going around the storm itself. So there's a light, almost like there's something behind the storm, manifesting very brightly so that it's actually lighting it up. It's kind of the way he's describing it. A brightness was around about it, and radiating out of its midst, like the color of amber out of the midst of fire. So now you can see this bright light that is around the storm, and also actually within the storm is like this bright amber color that's coming out of here. So you have these dark clouds that are swirling within itself, and there's fire within these clouds that are swirling and engulfing themselves. And then outside of this cloud, you have this amber glow throughout the cloud, in the way that he's describing this. Within the midst of the storm was like an eye of amber from the middle of the fire. And that's Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 4, where he's talking about it. So after all of this and all this is going on, in the very midst, there's kind of like this eye of fire that looks like amber sitting in the middle of the storm. And that's what he's describing. Amber, interestingly enough, is actually a color that is typically used with judgment. So Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 2 is an example of this. Over in Ezekiel 2:8, it says, "Then I looked, and there was a likeness like the appearance of fire from the appearance of his waist, and downward fire, and from his waist upwards like the appearance and brightness of a color of bright amber." And of course, in the context, he's talking about one who is coming in judgment. So the color itself does tend to relate to judgment. Of course, in the context and what Ezekiel is going to talk about, there is going to be some judgment involved in what he's actually referring to. I'm back over in Ezekiel chapter 1 and moving into verse 5. He goes on, it says, "Also, from within it came the likeness of four living creatures." You could certainly translate this as creatures. You could literally translate it as beings, because that's actually the word is actually living ones, is the way that it's describing it. It's not using creature like an animal in that sense. So it's not using that particular word. In our translations, the living creature, that's fine to understand, but realize that it's a living being that he's actually referring to here. And there's four of these, and they're likened to these living beings. And they are seen, these same ones are actually seen in the book of Revelation before the throne over in Revelation. So over in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 6, we see the same terminology being used. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne there were four living. Now again, it uses the word creatures, but in the original it just literally is living ones or living beings. And I don't think creature is a bad translation of it. It's just understanding what's behind it, is what he's describing here. Ezekiel is actually describing the cherubim. Now, the cherubim, yeah, I do talk about that in a little bit, because the cherubim, we want to understand what kind of spirit beings they are. But first of all, what he's doing is he's describing these cherubim. So in back over in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 6, each one had four faces and each one had four wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of a man were under their wings on their four sides, and each of the four had faces and wings. So all four of them is describing in the same way. Their wings touched one another. The creatures did not turn when they went, but each one went straight forward. Which again is kind of an interesting description. So these particular ones he's describing, they have four faces, so one on each side, and they have wings, and they have hands like a man, and they have feet kind of similar to that of a calf. Now, again, he's using language that he knows to kind of interpret this being that is like nothing he has ever seen. So he's using similarities in the way that he's describing this. Okay. Cherubim are the highest rank of spirit beings. We have the cherubim, the seraphim, and the angels. The word cherub itself occurs 94 times in Scripture and is only used of spirit beings. A cherub is not a fat little baby with wings. And if you understand what I mean, because that's usually what we actually make them. That is not what a cherub is. A cherub is one of the highest level of created beings that God has made. And it's quite an incredible being as we go through and describe this. I mean, these particular ones here, because there's different classes of cherubim. And by the way, it is cherubim, it is not cherubims. And what do I mean by that? Because you'll see this in your some of your translations. Cherubim is a plural. Cherub is singular. So if you say cherubims with an S at the end, you're pluralizing a plural. And now most people wouldn't care, but somebody who knows Hebrew, you'd be like, oh, that's really annoying because you don't pluralize a plural. So actually, if you're saying cherubim, you're referring to multiple cherubs. Is actually what that word means. So there are three classes of cherubs. So they're the highest rank, but of that highest rank, there are three classes within that rank. Those who have one face and two wings, as seen in the inner cherub, the cherubs covering the propitiatory seat on the ark of the covenant. So this is over in Exodus. So Exodus chapter 25 and verse 19. Make one cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end, You shall make the cherubs at the two ends of it of one piece with the mercy seat. Now, by the way, this actually is not, mercy seat is not a good translation of this particular word. This is not a place of mercy. This is a place of propitiation, of satisfaction. That is actually what it's referring to. I don't know why they opted in many of our translations to translate it as mercy. It's not your Hebrew word for mercy. It's literally your Hebrew word for a covering, a place of covering. Now that's what it's describing. Now we do find from the New Testament that this is specifically related to the place of propitiation over in Hebrews. It talks about that in the book of Hebrews. But you have these two, and the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the propitiatory seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be towards the actual seat. So you can see there's one face because that face is towards the actual covering seat. So this is one level of, or one class of a cherub. Then we have those who have two faces and two wings. And we see this over in Ezekiel, and this is in Ezekiel 41. Ezekiel chapter 41, and starting in verse 18. And it was made with cherubim and palm trees, and a palm tree between cherub and cherub. Each cherub had two faces, so that the face of a man was towards a palm tree on the one side, and the face of a young lion towards the palm tree on the other side. Thus it was made throughout the temple all throughout. So we have within the inner area of the temple, that would be the Holy of Holies, we have the cherubs represented there that have one face. Outside of the temple, we have the cherubs that are actually represented as having two faces. So in describing that. And then we have those who have four faces. And these four faces are similar to a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a human. I did not put this in your notes, but we will eventually when we get to this area, we'll run into it. But I'll go ahead and bring this up because it will be in Ezekiel when we're talking about this. Over in Ezekiel chapter 28 and it goes down to verse 14 because it's talking about Lucifer. And this is the one we know as Satan, whose name is Lucifer. Lucifer means the morning star, the star of the dawn, is what it actually means. And you see that he was the anointed cherub. He was a cherub. Okay. Or I should say is a cherub. He's still a cherub, he's just fallen. Okay, you were the anointed cherub who covers. I establish you. You were in the holy mountain of God. And of course, the holy mountain of God, what it's talking about there is the government of God. He was the one who covered all of the entire universe. He ruled over the entire universe. He is a cherub who has one face and two wings. That's who he is. Right? He's not a little devil, not a little red devil with horns. He does not reside in hell. He has never been to hell. He will go there, and by hell I literally mean Hades, the place that's in the center of the earth. He will go there for 1,000 years in the millennial kingdom, but he hasn't been there yet. So he's not sitting there waiting for souls to win. Some of the ridiculous things people come up with, to try to scare people. Satan's not running around trying to steal people's souls. The souls of the unsaved already belong to him. The only ones he loses are the saved, and there's nothing he can do about that. Simple as that, because that's God's work. So these are our cherubs. They are quite intense beings, as we'll see. And they can be involved in protection, and they are typically involved with the throne and with what God is doing directly from there. More in a high-level governmental perspective. This, by the way, is interesting to understand because when it comes to cherubs, this is actually something that I recently did on on our morning the morning memory verses that I do. I don't remember if I've actually sent this one out yet, but it will be coming out soon if I haven't, because we have the failure of Adam and Eve, and of course they ate from the from the fruit of the tree of the garden. And it talks about when they were actually kicked out of the garden, that the Lord put a cherub there. Why would he put a cherub there? So this is in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 24. And he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden. So cherubim are of the highest rank of spirit beings. Demons are from the angels, and the angels are the lower rank. Spirit beings do not speak against, disrespect, or disobey one of a higher rank. They do not do that, not like humans do. So now we have cherubim sitting and guarding the way into the garden, which would mean the demons could not actually manipulate the situation and get back in there. Now, why would they want to do that? Because there was another tree in there, okay? And the tree of life. And anybody who ate from that tree, their physical life would continue for a long, long time. Now, they'd have to keep eating for that, but God didn't actually ultimately permit that. Thankfully, because that would not have been a bad thing. But we see them involved in that. And now the other rank is a seraph. And a seraph is a word that literally means one that is burning. We see the seraph over in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 2. This word seraph, by the way, is also actually used describing a serpent that is poisonous. A fiery serpent or a poisonous serpent. It actually uses the word fiery, but that's where it's talking about when it bites you, it's the fiery sensation you get from the poison. That's what it's describing. It uses the same term for them. So above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings, with 2 who covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew, and he cried one to another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. We get an example here of what they're actually doing, because they are the ones who are before the throne of God, and they are representing and reminding created beings that God is 3 persons that are individual yet one. Well, how do I say that? Because he says, Holy, holy, holy. God does not accept, like, or even encourage vain repetition. Repeating the same word for no reason is not something that's acceptable to God. So praising God is not saying holy, 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 and you have to, because it's not just that you're holy, but you're holy, and therefore you are the holiest. It's not, that's not the way it works. Holy, 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 your word holy means separated. It's describing the 3 persons of the Godhead. And the spirit beings see this. Seraph occurs 7 times in Scripture. So it doesn't occur a lot. And they are directly related to the altar. And like I said, before the throne of God. And then we have our angels. And our angels, the word angel is literally defined as messenger. Therefore, it must be determined by context if we're dealing with a human messenger or a spirit being, because we use the same word for both, because it literally means a messenger. Satan, his messenger, angel, sit to be a thorn in Paul's side to ensure that he was not exalted above measure. This is over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelation, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan. Now, this word messenger is angel. An angel from Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Because Paul had such an incredible knowledge about what was coming. He shared a substantial amount with us, but there is it's in the book of Hebrews where he talks about Melchizedek. There were some of the things that related to the Melchizedek order that he couldn't talk about because we weren't able to understand them. He had a lot more revelation than he was able to share with us. But we did get all of the information that we actually need. So Paul was faithful as a steward, and he did actually provide everything we actually need. So don't think, oh, if I only knew more. I would like to know more about the Melchizedek order, but it's not going to impact my Christian life in one way or the other, whether I knew it. It's just kind of one of those things that'd be nice to know. So back over into Ezekiel as he begins to describe these creatures. So over in Ezekiel chapter 1 and then back in verse 10. The faces and the wings, of course, for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man. Each of the four had the face of a lion on the right side. Each of the four had a face of an ox on the left side, and each of the four had the face of an eagle. Now, eagle, by the way, is a relative term, and what I mean by that is the Hebrew word can also mean vulture, because of course, eagle actually is within that class of a bird. It's more of a vulture type of bird, and it is describing them in the way that he's visioning them to what he understands in his own life and perception. It is interesting to note, though, when he says that, like for an example, that they have the appearance of a man. Cherubs were created before humans were created. So really, the human would have a face kind of similar to that of a cherub, is where it would describe. Just like a lion would have a face similar to that of a cherub, because a cherub was actually created first. Of course, but the way he's describing this, he's trying to compare with what he knows at this point. Thus their faces, this is in verse 11, thus were their faces. Their wings stretch upward. Two wings of each one touched one another, and the two covered their bodies. So you have two of their wings coming up and touching over the top of their head, and then the others covering their body at this point. He then goes on to talk about their movement, and each one went straight forward. They went wherever the Spirit wanted to go, and they did not turn when they went. So again, there's so much, just it very much reminds me of chess, because you have certain pieces in chess that cannot rotate, they go in one direction or another. Well, that's the way they did. They don't ever rotate. They would never have a reason to rotate because they got faces on all sides. So they can see everything. So whichever direction they want to go, they always go straight forward, whichever one that they want to go in that sense. And then in verse 13, and for the likeness of the living creature, their appearance was like burning coal of fire, like the appearance of torches going back and forth among the living creatures. There was fire, was bright, and out of the fire went lightning. So we have this appearance of fire and the appearance of what appears to be torches kind of running around next to them, within them. And then in verse 14, he talks about the speed of cherubim. And the living creatures ran back and forth in appearance like the flash of lightning. That's how quick they moved across the sky. It was like a flash of lightning. Now, again, this would have to be in a vision because the human eye wouldn't be able to see this kind of stuff. So the Lord is permitting him to see this within a vision. And then the appearance of the sky we get in verse 22 roundabout, but actually in verse 15 he goes on. Now, as I looked at the living creature, behold, a wheel was on the earth. Beside each living creature with its four faces. The appearance of the wheel and their workings was like the color of a beryl, and all the four had the same likeness. The appearance of their workings was as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Now, this is kind of hard to describe, and I should do some drawing to kind of describe this stuff. And I've seen several drawings on it because you have a wheel that's within another wheel, and they're able to turn within each other. And this is actually something that's with the living creature. But we'll see this is not a vehicle in which the living creature is riding upon. This is actually part of the living creature. Because at first, when you're thinking wheels and other stuff like that, you're kind of thinking, well, maybe he's in some kind of instrument to move him around. When they moved, they went forward, or when they went towards any one of the four directions, they did not turn aside when they went. So the wheels did the same thing. So you have the living creature and the wheels down on the earth, and they move exactly like the living creature moves. So they move with them. So they're not turning around or twisting or anything like that. And as their rims, they were so high, they were awesome, and their rims were full of eyes all around the four of them. So all around, all of days within there's what he's describing as eyes. So again, the cherubim have no reason to turn because they can see in all directions, is what it's describing. All directions, all areas. That's what he's describing. They have no reason to actually turn in the way he's describing these. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up with them. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went because because there the Spirit went, and the wheels were lifted together with them, for the Spirit of the living creature within the wheels, showing us that it's actually a part of their being. So they were within these wheels. When those went, these went. When those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up together with them. For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. And then he starts describing the sky, and the likeness of the firmament above the heads of the living creature was like the color of awesome crystal stretched out over their heads. And under the firmament, their wings spread out straight, one towards another. Each one had two which covered one side, and one each, and each on one had two which covered the other side of his body. And when they went, I heard the noise of their wings was like the noise of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, a tumult. Try to get that one out. A tumult like the noise of an army, and they stood still. Then they let down their wings. So you have this incredible sound when they actually move also. A very incredible sound, very thunderous type of a sound, like that of an army moving or great waters moving. That's the way their wings actually sounded. So he's giving a description of that. And now at this point, we're going to have a voice coming from the firmament that's going to talk to him. And God willing, next time we come into Ezekiel, we will pick that up. But